Okay. Hi, welcome. I'm very delighted to present you our post-lunch panel. I do hope you enjoyed our lunch, and I do hope I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting panel ahead of us. My name is Omer Aloni, and of course I'm AYLH 2015 conference. So to be on a rush, so we'll start with our first one. Well, sorry, the panel is going to deal with criminal law in transition, and we have 4 speakers. Okay, and we'll start with Jonathan Nash. Okay. Jonathan is from the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. If I'm making some mistakes, so please do correct me. From New York, Jonathan is an assistant professor of history at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in Minnesota, in the States. He's working right now on a manuscript, right, on incarcerated Republic prisoners, reformers, and a penitentiary in the early United States between 1790 and 1860, which analyzed the actions of prisoners and daily life routine inside Pennsylvania and New York state prisons. His lecture is Unquiet Spirits and the transition to incarceration in early United States. So please, Jonathan, the floor is yours. Okay, and please try to manage to keep time.
Where should I go? Here? Yeah? All right.
Do you want to sit over here?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you for having me, and I'm enjoying the weather because it's much warmer here than it is in Minnesota, where I just came from. So I shall begin. In the years following the American War for Independence, white middling class men replaced public punishments with imprisonment at hard labor inside a penitentiary. They argued that public punishments did not reform criminals or deter crime. According to most historians, reformers in Pennsylvania who replaced public punishment with imprisonment were idealist men inspired by European philosophers, Christianity, a transatlantic culture of sensibility, and British prison reformers. The writings of Pennsylvania reformers and the language of the laws that they passed suggests that they saw themselves as doing something new and patriotic. In their minds, they had broken from the laws of the colonial past to create new laws for the future. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reformers throughout the United States emulated Pennsylvania's new criminal code. This well-known story of the transition toward incarceration in Pennsylvania, and by extension in the early United States, is incomplete. For the most part, historians tend to neglect to account for the active influence of convicted criminals, who contemporaries called unquiet spirits, who, in addition to reformers, played an important role in the transition from public punishment to incarceration. These men frustrated middling-class Philadelphians' initial attempts in 1786 to sentence convicted criminals to public labor. The actions of these men convinced legislatures to establish a new site of punishment in 1790, the Walnut Street Prison. By shifting our focus from a top-down study of criminal law reform to a bottom-up study, we can chart a multivocal history of punishment that illuminates how criminals' actions influenced the late 18th and early 19th century transition in the United States from public punishment to incarceration. In the years following the American Revolution, a crime wave washed over Pennsylvania. The numbers of murders, assaults, burglaries, robberies, and larcenies increased. In November 1786, legislators responded by reforming Pennsylvania's criminal code. For all individuals convicted of non-capital crimes, the code, which contemporaries called the Wheelbarrow Law, prescribed continued hard labor, publicly and disgracefully imposed, in streets of cities and towns, and upon the highways of the open country and other public works. Legislators thought the new law would achieve multiple goals. First, by compelling convicted criminals to labor in public, they hoped that the law would teach criminals the virtues of labor and provide them with skills that they could employ upon their release to gain lawful employment. Second, laboring in public would make criminals feel the scorn of law-abiding citizens. Third, the spectacle of public labor plus convicted criminals' shame would deter others from committing crimes. While wearing multicolored uniforms, chains, and iron balls, and under the supervision of keepers, convicted criminals were to work throughout Philadelphia, the capital of Pennsylvania. They were to shovel, sweep, and scrape grime, mud, and debris from the streets and sidewalks. They were to quarry the stone that masons used to build the city's mansions, houses, and public buildings. They were to chop the firewood that heated the Pennsylvania Hospital, almshouse, jail, and other public institutions. They were to dig ditches, remove and level earth. They were to excavate the county courthouse's cellar. Their labor was to improve and strengthen the infrastructure of the city. Public labor made these marginal criminal men unavoidable and visible to all Philadelphians. The reality of convicted criminals' public labor did not fulfill legislators' hopes. The men, called wheelbarrow men, offered strange spectacles to the public, not objects of deterrence or shame. President Thomas Jefferson recalled, and I'll quote for you, "Exhibit it as a public spectacle, with shaved heads and mean clothing, working on the high roads, produced in the criminals such an abandonment of self-respect as, instead of reforming, plunged them into the most desperate and hardened depravity of morals and character." Likewise, Quaker philanthropist Roberts Vox claimed that the men were encumbered with iron collars and chains to which the bombshells were attached, to be dragged along while they performed their degrading service, under the eye of keepers armed with swords, blunderbusses, and other weapons of destruction. Many wheelbarrow men refused to play the role of industrious, docile penitents. They resented wearing absurd uniforms while working in public. Some of the men who wore a heavy ball and chain around their ankles would throw the ball down with all their strength to damage the streets and sidewalks. Other men would throw the ball at citizens who frequently taunted and insulted them. Many wheelbarrow men maintained their criminal ways. A 19th century newspaper editor named Thompson Westcott claimed, It was no unusual thing for one of them to snatch a watch or some other valuable article from the pocket of a passerby and slip it from one to another of the gang so dexterously that the article could not be recovered. A local newspaper reported that these men frequently exhibit the most horrid scenes on this side of the infernal regions, abusing the inhabitants and beating their keepers. Wheelbarrow men also communicated with their friends, from whom they received food, money, and liquor while laboring on the city's streets. Wheelbarrow men often revolted and escaped as well. During the evening of the 19th of March, 1787, when they returned to the Walnut Street jail after a long day of work, guards noticed that one man's irons were loose. Guards sent a blacksmith to tighten the irons. The man and the other men in his apartment, a room that confined at least 8 convicts, attacked the blacksmith. They then attempted to climb the jail's gates. A short time later, the local militia arrived to suppress the insurrection. Militiamen killed one convict and wounded another. According to Westcott, the insurrection was caused by the great repugnance which the convicts had to the wheelbarrow service. 5 months later, militiamen again opened fire on wheelbarrow men who rebelled. This time, one wheelbarrow man was severely wounded. In October of the same year, 3 wheelbarrow men escaped. Less than a year after the law went into effect, a correspondent in a local newspaper called the Independent Gazetteer concluded, "The late alarming increase of robberies in this city is proof of the inefficacy of the wheelbarrow law in its present form." The actions of wheelbarrow men made it appear that employing convicts at public labor had little benefit, but spread disorder. Wheelbarrow men's frequent escapes terrified the inhabitants of Philadelphia. In October 1788, 33 wheelbarrow men escaped. The men immediately resumed their criminal ways. They robbed an Irish immigrant of 8 guineas, plundered another young man, and then tied him to a stake. A local newspaper warned that citizens who traveled at night would do well to arm themselves. Escaped wheelbarrow men even committed crimes in New York City. Wheelbarrow men's crimes led one visitor to observe. They spread terror over town and country, and far from being put in the way of amendment, became initiated in new scenes of wickedness. No wonder a writer in Lippincott's magazine later claimed, "Children huddle around the evening fire with eyes dilated at the tales of servants concerning the wheelbarrow men." The most atrocious incident involving wheelbarrow men occurred on the 18th of September, 1789. That afternoon, 5 men, Daniel Cronin, John Burns, John Bennett, John Logan, and John Ferguson, labored near Philadelphia's Center Square. One of the men, seeking a tin can for the purpose of getting a drink of water, knocked on the front door of the McFarland brothers' house. When one of the McFarlands answered the door, the wheelbarrow man saw a large pile of money on the table. With his can in hand, the man returned to the neighboring pump to share a drink with his fellow laborers. While enjoying a cool, refreshing drink, he explained what he saw. During their afternoon drink and their conversation, the men resolved to escape to rob the brothers McFarland. The men escaped that evening. Before heading to the McFarland house, they met up with John Logan's wife. The men and Logan's wife, armed with a lantern and a pump handle, then went to the McFarland's house. They gained entry to the house and bludgeoned John McFarland in the most barbarous manner. During the struggle, the robber's lantern was extinguished, and darkness engulfed the interior of the house, which allowed the uninjured McFarland to escape. Once the robbers relit their lantern, they ransacked the house. They found and stole approximately $2,000. Before exiting the house, the robbers heard the moans of the wounded brother. According to Westcott, the newspaper editor, Logan's wife proclaimed she would, quote, "finish him," and coolly battered his head against the wall until she thought he was dead. He died the next day. A few days later, police arrested the men and Logan's wife, who shortly thereafter were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On the 12th of October, a crowd gathered to watch the criminals hang from a scaffold erected on the city commons near where they had committed their crimes. The wheelbarrow men who robbed and murdered John McFarland decisively turned citizens against employing convicted criminals on the streets of Philadelphia. Opposition against the wheelbarrow law had not begun with the McFarland murder, however. In a March 1787 lecture at a meeting of the Society for Political Inquiries, convened at the home of Benjamin Franklin, physician and reformer Benjamin Rush argued against employing criminals on public works. He claimed that their employment at public labor will render labor of every kind disreputable, more especially that species of it which has for its objects the convenience or improvement of the state. Furthermore, Rush argued that wheelbarrow men allured spectators from their businesses and thereby deprived the state of greater benefits from the industry of its citizens than it can ever derive from the public labor of criminals. And in one of his own letters to his wife, he provides an example of this in which he sees wheelbarrow men outside of his front door and has to come outside to stare at them. And there's a whole crowd of people around these men. So what Rush decided the best course would be is removing the men from the public's view and hiding them behind the walls of a prison where they would labor in private. Rush was not the only commentator who complained about criminals who labored in public. Writers to the city's newspapers contended that criminals did not fear the wheelbarrow law and that it failed to deter crime. A correspondent to the Independent Gazetteer argued that the law has ceased to be a punishment. It serves only to make bad men worse, and is therefore unpopular and odious in every part of the state. Another writer observed, "The merciful tenderness of the law served only to encourage criminals' bloody depredations." In place of the law, some writers suggested returning to the practice of public physical punishments, while another writer proposed shipping criminals to Algiers for the exchange of what he called our unhappy countrymen at present held in chains, who are captives of Barbary pirates. The correspondent to the Independent Gazetteer implored the government to remove the wheelbarrow men from the sight of our citizens, whom he claimed offered dreadful spectacles of human misery and depravity, which meet us in every street. He, like Rush, recommended replacing public labor with solitary imprisonment at hard labor. And then lastly, a writer to the Federal Gazette claimed, "To be delivered to a merciless overseer of a public work of any kind, or to be delivered to a sheriff for execution, are both light punishments compared with a wicked man being delivered by solitude and confinement to his own reflections." The actions of the wheelbarrow men pushed legislators to stop sentencing convicted criminals to public labor. In 1789, legislators abolished the wheelbarrow law, and in 1790 replaced public criminal labor with confinement at hard labor inside Philadelphia's Walnut Street prison. Although the wheelbarrow men disappeared from the streets, their actions and resistance strategies continued inside the prison. Prisoners possessed the same unquiet spirits that the wheelbarrow men possessed. They rebelled, escaped, and fought one another. They broke tools and worked slowly as well as carelessly. They also formed relationships, boasted of their exploits, and yearned for liberty. In less than 40 years, the actions of prisoners would push Philadelphians to view the Walnut Street prison, just as they had previously viewed public convict labor, as a failure. As I hope this brief paper has suggested, for a fuller accounting of the transition to incarceration in the early United States, historians would do well to account for the actions of criminals. Thank you.